Hello everyone, welcome to the Pocket-Sized Tales YouTube channel. My name is Edward, and I'll be narrating this episode's stories. We usually write and narrate our own stories, but in this episode we got a collection of the scariest ones we found from around the web. The links to them are in the description. If you like what we do here, please consider purchasing some merchandise from the Pocket Shop. Leave us a super thanks and of course like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification to be alerted whenever a new episode is uploaded. Also share our content with your friends and family. With that said, let's get on with the stories. Story 1. I've always loved ghost stories. You know the kind. Whispered around campfires, shared in hushed tones, stories of the inexplicable and the eerie. Little did I know I'd soon become a character in my very own ghost story, working as a nurse. It was a frigid winter night, and I was assigned to the graveyard shift. The hospital was dimly lit, and the only sound that broke the silence was the relentless howling of the wind outside. Patients were few and far between, and I had some time to catch up on paperwork. As I sat alone in the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle, every creak in the building sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't long before the lights above my head started flickering, casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. I blamed it on old wiring and tried to focus on my charts, but that's when I heard the whispers. Soft, barely audible voices coming from the hallway outside the station. I strained to listen, and it sounded like the distant murmur of a conversation. Peering into the hallway, I saw no one, but the whispers persisted, growing slightly louder. As I cautiously made my way down the corridor, the voices seemed to recede further and further, like they were leading me on a macabre treasure hunt. The source of the voices became clear when I entered an abandoned wing of the hospital. It was dark and unheated, a place where no patient had been in years. And yet, I found myself standing before a room with a flickering light. The door swung open with a soft groan, and I was met with a scene that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The room was adorned with antique medical equipment, a stark contrast to the modernity of the rest of the hospital. On the bed lay a frail and gaunt figure, their eyes locked on mine. The figure mouthed something to me that I couldn't hear nor understand. Before I could respond, the room plunged into darkness and the door slammed shut. I fumbled for my phone, using its feeble light to find my way out. I fled the abandoned wing and returned to the nurse's station, shaken and breathless. I continued working there until I found another job. But in that time frame, I heard phantom footsteps echoing through the empty hallways and ghostly figures appearing in the corners of my vision, vanishing when I turned to look. Patients who were alone would suddenly start talking to someone I couldn't see. I talked to the other nurses about it, but they were either dismissive or tight-lipped about these occurrences. Thinking back there had to be something about that place, like maybe those souls were somehow trapped there. Those hauntings occurred too often for them to be coincidences. But I never thought I'd be a part of my very own ghost story. Story 2. Years ago, I used to work as a security guard at a hospital, specifically in the ED psych ward. One night, we received a call for assistance from the clinical staff. They needed our help managing a situation involving a particularly combative patient who happened to be hyper-religious and was securely restrained to their bed. As my coworker and I assisted in holding down the patient, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The patient's agitation reached a breaking point, and they began screaming loudly, eventually transitioning into speaking in tongues. It was an unsettling and chaotic scene. In the midst of this turmoil, an inexplicable event occurred. I witnessed the bed to which the patient was strapped to begin to lift off the floor, starting with one side and then the other. I was rendered temporarily speechless, unable to comprehend the surreal occurrence, and it seemed my fellow staff members were equally taken aback. After a few moments, I managed to snap out of my shock, and together with the clinical staff, we worked diligently to calm the patient down. Once the situation was under control, I stepped out of the room, still bewildered by what I had witnessed, and turned to my coworker to ask in disbelief, "Did you see that?" To my amazement, he confirmed that he had indeed witnessed the inexplicable levitation of the patient's bed. Story 3. I've been a nurse for several years. working the night shift at a hospital that has seen its fair share of dark tales and chilling stories. But it wasn't until I encountered the phantom patient that I truly believed in the supernatural. It all began on a particularly gloomy night. The hospital corridors were nearly empty, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only company I had. As I made my rounds, I noticed something unusual at the far end of the hallway. There, under the dim, flickering lights, stood a patient. I couldn't make out their face, shrouded in darkness, but the sight sent a shiver down my spine. What patient would be wandering the halls at this hour? I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridor. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling ever so slightly. The patient didn't respond. Instead, they turned and began walking further down the hallway. It was as if they expected me to follow. I followed the patient, my curiosity piqued and my fear rising with every step. The patient's figure remained elusive, as though they were composed of shadows themselves. I couldn't see their face, their features, or even their clothing. It was as if they were a silhouette lost in the darkness. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, far beyond the usual length of that corridor. We passed closed doors, but when I tried to peek inside, they were empty patient rooms, void of any life. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind as I realized that something was deeply wrong. Finally, the patient halted in front of a closed door to room 307. It was a room that had been abandoned for years, left to decay and gather dust. I was frozen in terror as the patient took a step into the door and vanished, leaving me in the silent stillness of the hallway. I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest, and called for help. Security personnel arrived, but when we opened room 307, it was empty. There was no sign of the patient or any explanation for what had just occurred. From that night forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, something that had chosen me to be a part of its enigmatic and chilling story. The phantom patient had forever changed the way I looked at the hospital and the unseen forces that lurk within its walls. Story 4. I used to work on a large medical surgical floor with a layout resembling a cross, intersected by 4 hallways. Several decades ago, one of these wings had been a children's ward, as evidenced by the faint, faded flowers still painted on the fire doors. However, the building had not hosted pediatric patients in many years. During my night shifts, although I wasn't a believer in ghosts, I couldn't help but wonder about the peculiar occurrences in that specific hallway. Periodically, the light covers would fall off and shatter. I often rationalized it, attributing it to the building's age, but it struck me as odd that these incidents solely transpired in that particular hallway, only at night, and never when a room was occupied. I remained open to the possibility of a reasonable explanation. The strangest phenomenon occurred over the years when patients started to complain about the noise emanating from children, playing and laughing, mentioning it hindered their sleep. To my surprise, this was the same hallway where I conducted my charting. It was also the very same hallway that always appeared dark and quiet. I must admit these reports sent shivers down my spine, and every time I saw those faded flowers on the door, I couldn't help but feel an eerie sense of unease. Story 5. I've been a nurse for quite some time, and I thought I had seen it all. But it wasn't until I started working the night shift in the coma ward of St. Mark's Hospital that I encountered something truly unsettling. The coma ward was always an eerie place at night, with its long, dimly lit corridors and the faint hum of machines keeping watch over the motionless patients. One night, as I made my rounds, I noticed something unusual. All the patients in the ward were murmuring in their sleep, and they all seemed to be saying the same cryptic message. I leaned in closer to one of the patients, an elderly man who had been in a coma for months. He whispered the words, "He's coming for us. He's coming for all of us." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I moved on to the next patient, and they too were uttering the same eerie warning, "He's coming for us." The message was the same with every patient in the ward, as if they were all sharing a collective nightmare. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something malevolent was lurking just beyond the edges of my understanding. I reported my findings to the senior nurse on duty, but she dismissed it as a coincidence, attributing it to the patient's comatose state. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Over the following nights, I continued to listen to the patient's whispered warnings, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. The more I listened, the more I became convinced that it was not a mere coincidence. It was a message, a warning, and I had to decipher its meaning. One fateful night, as I stood by the bedside of a patient, I felt a presence in the room, a dark, oppressive force. The patient's voice grew more urgent as they whispered, "He's coming to take us away." At that moment, the lights in the room flickered and I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the corner. The figure seemed to be cloaked in darkness, with glowing, malevolent eyes fixed on the patient. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. The shadowy figure moved closer to the patient, and I finally found my voice, screaming for help. Nurses rushed into the room, but the figure had vanished, and the patient lay still, as if nothing had happened. The hospital administration conducted an investigation, but they found no evidence of foul play or supernatural activity. They chalked it up to stress and exhaustion on my part, but I knew what I had seen and felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that the coma ward was a place where the boundaries between our world and something darker and more sinister had blurred. Story 6. To preface this story, I am a nurse, working with geriatric patients. This happened about 3 years ago. It was late night. I was on lunch and decided to take a nap at my car since I wasn't hungry. I set my alarm for 30 minutes, covered myself with my sweater, and dozed off. About 5 minutes into my sleep, someone knocked on the window of my car, waking me up. I glanced up and was surprised when I saw Deanna, who was a patient of mine. "Deanna, what the hell are you doing out here?" I asked. "I'm looking for my daughter," she replied. "Go back inside. We'll call her in the morning," I said. Unsatisfied with my response, Deanna got angry and started banging on the window. Terrified, I tried to reach for the car handle so I could get out to calm her down, but I couldn't get up. It was at that moment I realized I was experiencing an episode of sleep paralysis. I fought it, squirming as hard as I could while Deanna proceeded to beat on my car. After what seemed like an eternity, I was finally able to break out of it, waking up from the dream drenched in sweat with my heart racing 100 miles an hour. I rolled down the window and sat there for a moment to cool off and compose myself before heading back to work. As I clocked back into my shift, I saw my supervisor, Jeanette, and 2 other nurses huddled in front of one of the patient rooms. Jeanette spotted me and waved me over. I made my way to them with a feeling of unease gnawing at me, thinking maybe there was something wrong with a ventilator, or maybe a patient had fallen. "We just lost Deanna," Jeanette said. My heart sank to my stomach as a chill ran down my spine upon hearing the news. I wasn't notified while on break since she was on the DNR list. Story 7. Working as a nurse in the maternity ward of our aging hospital was always a bittersweet experience. Witnessing the joy of new life being brought into the world was heartwarming, but there was an unsettling side to our ward that I couldn't ignore. It all began during one chilly winter night when the hospital was enveloped in an eerie silence. My fellow nurses and I were going about our usual routines, preparing for deliveries and tending to expectant mothers. But as the hours grew later, we began to hear faint cries that had no place in a maternity ward. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a baby in distress. I rushed to the source of the sound, only to find an empty nursery. The cries persisted, growing louder and more desperate, and other nurses joined me in our fruitless search for the invisible infant. As the nights passed, the cries continued, and strange things began to happen. Nurses reported seeing spectral figures cradling invisible babies, their ghostly forms rocking in the dim light of the nursery. The cries, though haunting, had an eerie sense of familiarity, as if the babies were still tethered to this world. The expectant mothers noticed too. Some would wake up in the middle of the night, insisting that a spectral nurse had taken their baby away, only to have them returned moments later, unharmed but with an otherworldly pallor. The cries and apparitions never truly ceased, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for these lost souls. I often wonder if there's a way to free them from their spectral existence, or if they are destined to forever haunt the maternity ward, their cries echoing through the empty halls as a reminder of the mysteries and the eeriness that shroud our hospital. Story 8. Working at the resident home was an experience like no other. I had heard about the history of the place. A retired military captain and his late wife, Margaret, had sold their house to the state. The plan was to transform it into a residence for mentally disabled teens. However, it was the lingering presence of Margaret, affectionately known as Maggie, that added an eerie layer to our daily routines. Before the residents moved in, there was a sense of unease in the house. Many of us believed that Maggie's spirit lingered within these walls. After all, it was here that she had spent her final moments. The residents referred to her as the old lady, and we staff lovingly called her Maggie, as if she were still watching over the house. Late at night, when the residents were asleep, we would sometimes put the TV on more adult programming to unwind. However, this simple act often led to mysterious occurrences. The TV would inexplicably turn off, and when we turned it back on, it would be tuned to a different channel, as if Maggie had her own preferences for what we should watch. But the most unnerving experiences were had by one particular nurse. It was as if the house had a personal vendetta against her. She would often claim that the carpet tripped me, and sometimes cupboards would swing open, causing knives to fall out, narrowly missing her. The other staff members and I couldn't help but suspect that Maggie was somehow involved. As time went on, it became evident that this nurse was not what she seemed. She was fired for abusing and stealing from the residents, and as her presence left the house, Maggie's presence seemed to grow stronger. It became apparent that Maggie had not only lingered in this house but had taken on the role of a protector. She watched over the residents, ensuring their safety and well-being. It was as if she had embraced her new role as a guardian for the young souls who now called the house their home. Maggie's watchful presence added a sense of reassurance to our work. While her spirit may have initially caused unease, her actions spoke of a caring, motherly figure dedicated to her children. She had found a new purpose in her afterlife, ensuring that the residents were safe and secure within the walls of her former home. Story 9. It all began 2 nights ago when the nursing staff was sitting at the central station, diligently charting patients' progress. The night shift was in full swing, and the hospital was eerily quiet. As they worked, a series of footsteps echoed down the otherwise empty hallway, growing louder with each step. The nursing staff exchanged puzzled glances. Pinebrook's intensive care unit was designed to be an open space where every room could be observed from the central station, and no patients were walking around. There were no rooms above them, only storage space, and the CT department was long closed for the night. The footsteps continued, unmistakably echoing down the hall. 2 or 3 times the footsteps made their presence known, as if someone were pacing up and down the corridor. The nurses quickly realized that there was no logical explanation for these sounds. Then, on the following night, the unsettling occurrences continued. Cupboard doors in 2 unoccupied patient rooms began to open and shut, creating a disconcerting rhythm of creaks and thuds. The nurses grew increasingly uneasy, and the tension in the unit was palpable. Finally, one nurse mustered the courage to ask her coworker about the bizarre events. With a grave expression, her coworker explained that these occurrences often followed the loss of a patient, especially if it was a sudden or traumatic passing. The staff had experienced 2 codes just the week before, and the hospital was filled with an eerie energy that left everyone on edge. Story 10. It was a particularly quiet night, and I was stationed at the nurse's desk, catching up on paperwork. The ward was mostly empty, with just a few patients in their rooms, all of them in comas or deep slumber. The only sounds that broke the silence were the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional creaks of the old hospital. I was sitting at the desk when the phone rang. I picked it up and heard a frail voice on the other end. "Hello? Is anyone there?" the voice asked. I hesitated, then replied, "Yes, this is the nurse's station. Can I help you?" The voice on the other end seemed hesitant. "I'm Mary," the voice said. "I've waited for hours. Someone was supposed to come see me about my release." "Okay, I'll be right there," I said, and hung up. I couldn't quite place the voice, and I didn't recall any patient named Mary. I decided to check it out, heading to the patient's room shown on the phone. I got there and saw the patient's name on the door was Anne. I entered the room to see the patient inside was sound asleep. Confirming there wasn't some sort of mix-up, I checked her chart, and sure enough, the patient there was Anne. Panic gripped me as I tried to make sense of the situation. Had Mary been a visitor? A family member? Or had I imagined the whole call? I rushed back to the nurse's station and turned to my coworker, who had been at the desk beside me. "Are you familiar with a patient named Mary?" I asked. My coworker looked puzzled. "The only Mary I know passed away this morning." I felt a chill run down my spine. That can't be right. I just got a call from her. My coworker frowned and checked the patient log for the day. There, in black and white, was the confirmation I dreaded. Mary had indeed passed away that very morning, several hours before my mysterious call.